The comforting aroma of roasted turkey, mingled with the spicy warmth of cinnamon candles and the crisp, fresh scent of pine branches, gently permeated the entire house. The lively sound of laughter bubbled up from the dining room, creating cheerful echoes that bounced softly off the polished wooden floors. There was a symphony of festive noise, the delicate clinking of porcelain plates, the ringing chime of glasses being raised in celebratory toasts, and the murmur of multiple conversations woven together. At the center of it all, seated serenely at the head of the long dining table, sat Helen, her expression a mixture of quiet observation and inner peace, as she watched her family members move busily around her, engaged in the vibrant tapestry of the holiday meal. She had chosen her attire with care for this special occasion. She wore her favorite red sweater, the one made of soft, comforting yarn that held a particular significance. It was the very sweater her late husband, Benjamin, had always admired, often remarking that it made her look as radiant and joyful as Christmas itself. As she surveyed the lively scene before her, the faces of her children and grandchildren bathed in the warm glow of the holiday lights, a deep sense of pride swelled within her chest, filling her heart. This, she thought with quiet certainty, was the essence of what she lived for, what gave her life purpose and meaning, seeing her beloved family gathered together under the familiar roof of her home, feeling secure and protected, their bellies full with good food, and their spirits bright with shared life and connection. Down at the far end of the table, somewhat detached from the central activity, perched Margaret, her granddaughter, her attention seemingly divided between the conversation swirling around her and the small, glowing screen of her phone. Beside her sat her boyfriend, a young man with slicked-back hair and a perpetually smug, self-satisfied grin. He leaned closer to Margaret, giving her a light, playful nudge. Helen, ever the attentive matriarch, saw this interaction and leaned forward herself, a gentle smile forming on her lips. She was ready to engage Margaret, to ask her about her upcoming college graduation, a significant milestone in her granddaughter's life. Helen felt a profound eagerness to express the depth of her pride, to tell Margaret just how immensely proud she was of her accomplishments. She also wanted to share a secret, something special she had been carefully saving, a gift intended specifically for this very moment, a symbol of her love and support for Margaret's future. But before she could even open her mouth, before the first word of her affectionate question could escape her lips, she heard it. The words cut through the festive atmosphere, landing with startling clarity, as sharp and distinct as the chime of a bell. "Grandma's just useless now," Margaret remarked, her voice casual, almost dismissive, accompanied by a small, indifferent shrug. The comment, delivered with an easy lack of concern, was loud enough for not just Helen to hear, but for the entire table, indeed, the entire room, to fall momentarily silent before a ripple of uneasy, slightly forced laughter followed. Her daughter, Carla, offered a weak, half-hearted verbal reprimand, a quickly murmured, "Margaret," but made no further effort to address or challenge the cruel remark. Her son, Henry, visibly uncomfortable, simply lowered his gaze, focusing intently on his plate as if it held the answers to all the world's problems. Margaret's boyfriend, meanwhile, let out a low chuckle, burying his amusement in his wineglass. In that devastating moment, No one, not a single person at the table, met Helen's eyes. She remained frozen, utterly still, her fork suspended in midair above her plate, the carefully prepared turkey beginning to grow cold and unappetizing beneath its rich gravy. Her breath hitched in her chest, a sharp, small sound of pain that went unnoticed. The festive buzz of the room seemed to recede, the laughter and conversation continuing around her. Yet she felt utterly disconnected, as if she had suddenly been placed behind a pane of thick glass, separated from the warmth and life, unseen and unheard. She didn't allow herself to cry. She didn't flinch or make any outward display of her shattered feelings. Instead, she simply managed a small, fragile, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, with deliberate, unnervingly steady movements, she gently set her fork down neatly beside her untouched dinner plate. Outside the window, large, soft snowflakes had begun their silent descent, swirling gently against the deepening blackness of the night sky, looking to Helen like a million forgotten wishes drifting aimlessly in the cold air. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Helen Bennett's cozy, welcoming home was unquestionably the vibrant, beating heart of every single family celebration. After her beloved husband, Benjamin, passed away 12 years prior, leaving a profound emptiness in her life and the family unit, Helen had made a quiet, unspoken vow to herself. It was a commitment rooted in love and determination. She would do whatever it took, bear any burden, make any sacrifice, to keep her family strong and connected, no matter what challenges or changes came their way. Birthdays, Easter brunches filled with colored eggs and sweet pastries, Thanksgiving dinners groaning under the weight of tradition, and, of course, every single Christmas she hosted them all, pouring her entire heart and soul into every single, minute detail. She would meticulously iron the fine linen tablecloths, crisp and white, that had belonged to her own grandmother. She would spend hours polishing the family silver until it gleamed under the soft light, each piece reflecting the long history it held. And she would bake pies from scratch, the kitchen filling with the sweet, comforting aroma of apples, pecans, or pumpkin, just like her grandmother had patiently taught her decades ago. Her children, Carla and Henry, would faithfully show up for these gatherings. Sometimes they would arrive a little late, often rushing in with explanations about traffic or last-minute errands, but they always came, usually greeting her with smiles and warm hugs that, at the time, felt genuine and reassuring. Margaret, her first grandchild, had been a particularly bright and shining light in Helen's life, a source of immense joy and focus after Benjamin's passing. Helen had been there for all of Margaret's significant early milestones, her wobbly first steps across the living room floor, the shy but determined performances in her ballet recitals, the proud moment of receiving her middle school graduation diploma. When Margaret finally got her driver's license, achieving a new level of independence, it was Helen who went the extra mile, surprising her with her own old Honda Civic. It wasn't a new, flashy car, but Helen had had it carefully polished and refurbished, a true labor of love and a practical gift given with deep affection. Helen's modest 2-story house was more than just a building. It overflowed with cherished memories, tangible echoes of a life lived and loved. In the springtime, The vibrant tulips she had carefully planted decades ago bloomed in cheerful rows along the front walkway, a splash of color against the awakening earth. In the depths of winter, despite the cold and the creaking complaints of her aging joints, she would still string festive lights across the porch, even when the old ladder felt wobbly and uncertain beneath her feet. Every single corner of that house, every wall, every shelf, seemed to be touched by the presence of her family, holding remnants of their shared history. Bright crayon drawings from a very young Margaret were still taped behind kitchen cabinet doors. A secret gallery of childhood art. Carla's collection of well-loved childhood books still sat neatly arranged on the living room shelves. Tales of adventure and fantasy gathering a fine layer of dust. Henry's old fishing gear, relics of teenage hobbies, lay piled in a corner of the garage. The house was a physical manifestation of the countless sacrifices Helen had made over the years, often without a second thought, instinctively prioritizing her family's needs above her own comfort or desires. When Benjamin's pension proved barely sufficient to cover the monthly mortgage payments and other rising expenses, she quietly took on tutoring neighborhood kids in the evenings, adding extra hours to her already full days just to make ends meet. When Henry needed financial assistance to cover his first semester of college, she didn't hesitate. Instead, she silently took out a second mortgage on the house, securing the funds he needed without burdening him with the details of her financial strain. When Carla navigated the painful and messy process of her divorce, Helen opened her doors and her heart without any hesitation, providing a safe haven even when it meant squeezing 2 extra people into her already modest home, sacrificing her own space and privacy. To Helen, love was not a passive emotion. It was an active principle, a constant state of service and dedication. Love, in her understanding, was synonymous with patience that stretched beyond limits, loyalty that never wavered, and the willingness to do things for others even when it was inconvenient, difficult, or demanded personal sacrifice. She didn't expect grand gestures or elaborate repayment for her efforts. All she truly desired was the simple, grounding feeling of being needed, of being a vital, integral part of something larger and more enduring than herself. The complex, imperfect, but deeply loved entity that was her family. Every year, as the Christmas season approached, she would begin preparing months in advance, carefully selecting and purchasing gifts, wrapping them with meticulous care, tying delicate bows, and writing personal, handwritten tags for each one. She made sure that every stocking hanging by the fireplace was generously stuffed with small treasures and treats, that every seat at the dining table was perfectly set with her best china and silverware, ready to welcome her loved ones. The family traditions they shared were simple, perhaps, but they were sacred to Helen, the ritual of opening just one present on Christmas Eve, the sometimes awkward but always done family photo in matching pajamas, the quiet moments spent sitting around the fire, each person sharing one thing they were genuinely grateful for that year. She believed, with a deep and earnest conviction, that she was teaching them something profoundly important through these consistent acts, that family wasn't about grand, infrequent displays, but about the unwavering commitment of showing up, year after year, through all of life's changes and challenges, no matter what. As the years gently, inevitably passed, those little cracks in the foundation of their connection the subtle signs of shifting priorities began to show. At first, they were easy enough for Helen to rationalize, to brush aside like dust bunnies under the rug. When Margaret skipped Thanksgiving dinner to spend it with friends in the city, prioritizing social plans over family tradition, Helen outwardly shrugged it off, telling herself and anyone who asked, "She's young. She should live her life, explore her independence." When Carla forgot Helen's birthday, not just once, but 2 years in a row, Helen forced a light laugh, reassuring herself that Carla probably just had too much on her plate, that her life was undoubtedly hectic. When Henry canceled their cherished annual summer barbecue, a tradition Helen looked forward to all year, citing work commitments that had suddenly materialized, Helen didn't complain. Instead, she sent him a thoughtful care package, including some of her homemade cookies, and told him genuinely that she understood that work was important. She always understood. She always forgave. She always operated under the deeply held assumption that the bonds of family, forged by shared history and blood, were inherently thicker and more resilient than the erosive forces of time, geographical distance, or simple neglect. In the quiet spaces between the grand gestures and planned gatherings, she took comfort in the smaller moments that still managed to make her heart soar. Brief glimpses of connection that she clung to desperately. A spontaneous call from Henry on a random Tuesday just to check in. A birthday card arriving in the mail from Carla, even if it was a little late. A quick, half-hearted hug from Margaret when she stopped by for a fleeting visit on her way to somewhere else. Her mind clearly preoccupied. "They were busy," she would whisper to herself, like a mantra. Life was just busy. But in the truly quiet moments, when the house felt vast and silent around her, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed unusually loud, a persistent, unwelcome guest doubt would creep in. She would wonder, with a pang of fear, if she was slowly but surely being left behind, if the life she had so painstakingly built was quietly moving on without her. Yet, when the holidays inevitably rolled around again, she would push the doubt away and pour herself back into the familiar rhythm of preparations. Her hope reignited, desperate to recreate the warmth, connection, and sense of belonging she had always known. The feeling of being surrounded by a family who truly saw and valued her. It wasn't foolishness that drove her. It was that enduring, stubborn hope. And that hope was powerful enough to keep her setting the perfect table, preparing elaborate meals, and choosing thoughtful gifts, all for people who, perhaps, no longer saw her in the same way they once had. This cycle continued until that seemingly ordinary Christmas night, when Margaret's careless, cutting words finally shattered the fragile illusion Helen had spent years carefully constructing and clinging to. The subtle shifts, the initial cracks in the facade, had actually begun to appear earlier, just a few weeks before Christmas, in early December. The first real sign flickered to life, small, almost easily dismissed, but undeniable once Helen truly allowed herself to see it for what it was. Helen was sitting at the large, sturdy oak dining table she and Benjamin had purchased together decades ago. A piece of furniture that had witnessed countless family meals, homework sessions, and heartfelt conversations. A cup of steaming chamomile tea sat by her elbow, its warmth spreading into the cool air and a notebook lay open in front of her, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. She had spent the entire afternoon immersed in research, diligently looking up scholarship options and gathering tips for successful graduate school applications. Margaret, after all, was planning to apply to some of the top law schools in the country, a demanding and competitive process, and Helen, ever eager to help, wanted to assist in any way she possibly could, offering her time and effort freely. When Margaret walked into the dining room, earbuds still dangling from her ears, a distracted, slightly strained smile tugging at her lips, Helen's heart lifted instantly with a surge of warmth and anticipation. She gently patted the chair next to her at the table, inviting Margaret to sit down. "I thought maybe we could go over some essay ideas together." "Sweetheart," Helen offered warmly, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm and affection, sliding the open notebook across the polished table toward her granddaughter. "I found some tips on how to make your applications really stand out, make them truly shine." Margaret paused, pulling one earbud out, the faint sound of music still audible from the other. She glanced quickly at the notebook-strewn table, then at Helen, her earlier smile tightening, losing its fleeting warmth. "That's sweet, Grandma. But you wouldn't really get what they're looking for these days," Margaret said lightly, her tone bordering on amused, almost laughing at the very idea. "It's all completely different now. It's not like when you were young and applying for things." The words, delivered so casually, stung Helen more deeply and painfully than they perhaps should have. She blinked, her hands still resting on the pages she had so carefully prepared, the notes she had diligently taken. "Oh," she managed to say, forcing a small, slightly strained chuckle, trying to mask the sudden ache in her chest. "Well, I suppose some things have indeed changed. Technology, processes, but hard work and sincerity. Those things, I believe, never really go out of style. Do they?" Margaret was already checking her phone again, her attention having clearly moved on, barely registering Helen's reply. "Yeah. Anyway, thanks though. I've got it covered. My advisor at school knows exactly what to do." Without waiting for any further conversation, without a backward glance, Margaret breezed past her, disappearing up the stairs with the restless energy of someone eager to brush aside something deemed obsolete or irrelevant. Helen sat there for a moment longer, the notebook still open, the pages of her careful research lying exposed, her cup of tea growing rapidly cold beside her. She tried, desperately, to shake off the feeling of dismissal, to rationalize the interaction. After all, Margaret was young people, she told herself, often thought they knew everything, believed their own experiences were entirely unique and superior. Still, the feeling of being easily dismissed, of having her offer of help so readily deemed irrelevant, lingered. It wasn't just the words Margaret had used. It was the effortless, almost dismissive way she had said them, as if Helen's lifetime of experience, her years of hard-earned wisdom, the countless sacrifices she had made, counted for absolutely nothing in this new, fast-paced, ever-changing world. Later that same night, when Helen recounted the brief exchange to Carla over the phone, her daughter simply laughed it off with a light, breezy tone. "Oh, Mom, you know how she is," Carla said dismissively. "She's just stressed about finals week. She's probably exhausted. Don't take it personally. You know she loves you." Helen nodded along, agreeing because that's what she had always done. She agreed with her children, minimizing her own feelings, trying to be the easygoing, understanding mother and grandmother. She didn't want to be perceived as the kind of parent or grandparent who clung too tightly, who made everything about themselves, who was overly sensitive or demanding. She told herself that perhaps she was, indeed, being too sensitive, that it wasn't really a big deal, just a fleeting moment of teenage thoughtlessness. And yet, despite her efforts to rationalize, deep down, something fundamental shifted within her that night. It wasn't a surge of anger that took root. It was something quieter, something more profound, a quiet, aching awareness, a tiny, persistent voice, barely a whisper at first, began to echo in the silent corners of her mind. You are becoming invisible to them. But still, clinging desperately to the familiar and the hopeful, Helen held on to the traditions, the rituals, the detailed plans she had already set in motion for Christmas. She wrapped Margaret's gifts with extra special care, choosing the prettiest paper and tying the bows just so, imbuing the process with a silent plea for connection. She meticulously ironed the good tablecloth, smoothing out every crease as if smoothing away her own doubts. She even baked batches of Margaret's favorite lemon bars, their sweet, tangy aroma filling the kitchen, hoping that the familiar scent, the taste of a cherished childhood treat, would somehow pull her granddaughter back to the simple, grounding love that Helen had always given so freely and unconditionally. She desperately wanted to believe that one careless, thoughtless comment didn't signify anything larger, anything more ominous, that the powerful forces of love, shared history, and blood ties were robust enough to withstand the subtle but relentless shifts of time and changing priorities. Helen buried the sting of hurt deep within herself, hidden beneath the facade of busy hands and hopeful smiles, focusing on the tasks at hand. Because surely, when they all gathered around her festive Christmas table, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the season she had so lovingly created, they would remember. Surely, they would truly see her, truly appreciate her efforts. Surely they would know, without a shadow of a doubt, that she mattered, that her presence was significant and valued. The first crack had appeared. Yes, but Helen, ever the optimist, chose to paint over it, willfully ignoring the unsettling possibility that the fracture already ran far deeper than she dared to admit. In the weeks that followed, leading inexorably towards Christmas Day, the growing shift in her family's behavior became increasingly difficult for Helen to ignore. The signs more frequent and less subtle. They started as small things, trivial in isolation. Things she tried her best to tell herself not to notice, not to dwell on. When she called Margaret to inquire if there was anything specific she would like for Christmas dinner, any favorite dish she missed. Margaret's responses were barely audible between yawns and distracted sighs. "I don't care, Grandma. Just whatever you're making. It's not that serious." The casual indifference in her voice felt like a physical blow. When Helen optimistically suggested they play a few of the classic family games they used to enjoy after dinner, board games, card games. Carla sighed audibly over the phone. "Mom, we're not kids anymore," she said, her tone conveying a mix of impatience and weariness. "Don't stress yourself out planning all that. We'll just hang out." "Hang out?" The phrase felt so dismissive, so utterly casual, as if visiting her was just a spontaneous, low-effort drop-in, not a deeply rooted tradition anchored in decades of shared love, history, and consistent effort. At the grocery store, navigating the familiar aisles, Helen found herself hesitating in the baking section, her hand hovering over the ingredients for the lemon bars, wondering, with a sudden ache of uncertainty, if she should even bother baking them this year, if anyone would truly appreciate the effort. She baked them anyway, driven by a stubborn hope, telling herself that when Margaret tasted them, the familiar flavor would trigger cherished memories. She would smile, a genuine, warm smile, and perhaps, just perhaps, she would come back to the simple, unconditional love that Helen represented. But when Helen tentatively mentioned the treats in the family group chat, a digital space where she often shared cheerful updates and photos, no one replied. Not a single response. Not even a quick thumbs-up emoji. Just silence stretching across the digital divide. The family photo Helen proudly displayed on her mantle, a glossy framed snapshot from 5 Christmases ago, capturing all of them smiling, arms linked, looking like the perfect happy family, began to feel less like a cherished memory and more like a relic, an artifact from a life that, for her, perhaps no longer truly existed. There were other small cruelties too, unintentional perhaps, but cutting nonetheless. Carla casually reassigned the traditional Christmas Eve dinner time via a breezy group text message, issuing a simple announcement without consulting Helen. "Hey everyone, hope 5:00 p.m. is good for everyone." Treating Helen's home as a neutral venue rather than her domain. Henry mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they might swing by if traffic wasn't too bad, his words lacking any firm commitment, making their visit sound like an optional detour rather than a confirmed plan. And Margaret, seemingly oblivious to the impact of her actions, actively liked posts on social media platforms about choosing your real family and cutting ties with toxic relatives, all while pointedly ignoring Helen's simple messages, asking when she might have some time to help decorate the Christmas tree. A tradition they had always shared. Helen was not naive. She understood, intellectually, that life moved fast, that young people, particularly, grew busy, their attention fragmented by countless demands and distractions. But this felt different. It wasn't just the natural busyness of modern life. It felt like indifference, a subtle but palpable turning away. She found herself gradually shrinking within the walls of her own home, her once dominant presence receding. She would leave the dining table meticulously set, even though no one stopped by for impromptu meals anymore. She would bake entire pies, their rich aromas filling the empty rooms, only to end up delivering slices to lonely neighbors because there was no one left in her own family who wanted them. She found herself decorating the Christmas tree mostly alone, humming softly to herself to fill the growing silence, placing ornaments that held deep significance, each one a tiny vessel of memory. One evening, she sat alone in the living room, the lights deliberately turned off, the only illumination provided by the soft, multicolored glow of the Christmas tree. The ornaments, hanging like jewels from the branches, seemed to glint with an almost mournful light, each one carrying a story, a memory, a connection to the past. Benjamin's favorite fishing ornament, a small, hand-painted wooden fish, dangling from a hook. Margaret's baby's first Christmas ornament, a fragile porcelain figure marking a joyous beginning. The simple, elegant porcelain angel her children had pooled their meager allowance money to buy her decades ago. A cherished gift from a time when their love felt uncomplicated and freely given. Each glittering memory served as a poignant reminder of a time when she felt truly needed, truly wanted, truly loved out loud, without question or hesitation. Now, in the quiet solitude of her home, she felt like a piece of old furniture, still present but somehow irrelevant, something everyone was too polite to completely disregard, but no longer truly valued enough to move or acknowledge. There had been no big fight, no dramatic confrontations, no cruel words hurled in anger that could be identified and perhaps repaired. Instead, it was a slow, persistent erosion of attention, a gradual dimming of affection, a quiet dismantling of belonging. Helen began, slowly at first, then more deliberately, to fill the spaces where love and connection used to reside. She read longer, losing herself in stories that offered escape and companionship. She took up gardening again, even in the cold grip of winter, tending to the indoor plants that Benjamin had loved, nurturing green life within the quiet house. She started writing letters she never intended to send, pouring her thoughts and feelings onto paper, capturing memories she feared would fade and die if she didn't record them. In the profound quiet of her home, the memories seemed to roar louder than ever before. Not memories of arguments or betrayals, but of a slow, quiet fading, of family traditions that only she seemed to cling to and value, of hugs that had grown mechanical and rushed, of conversations that felt obligatory, timed, and ultimately hollow. She was becoming invisible, and the most painful part was that it was happening right in front of her, within the very walls that held her life's history. Still, despite the growing awareness, despite the ache of neglect, Helen clung to the idea of Christmas Day with a desperation she didn't want to admit. Even to herself, she told herself, perhaps as a final act of faith, that it would be different once they were all under her roof again. Once the familiar smells of baking and pine, the sound of carols, and the warmth of the season wrapped them up like they used to. Like a comforting blanket, she told herself, clinging to a fragile hope that when they saw her effort, when they sat around the table she had so carefully prepared, when they opened the gifts she had so painstakingly chosen, they would remember. Surely they would remember, because the only thing worse than the fear of being forgotten was the crushing realization that you had already been. Christmas Day finally arrived, but something in the air felt different this year. Heavier, tinged with an unspoken sadness that Helen couldn't quite shake. Helen woke early, the first hint of dawn barely visible outside her window, slipping out of bed with the same surge of hopeful excitement that had fueled her every Christmas morning for decades. She went through the familiar, comforting rituals, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the quiet kitchen, warming the cinnamon rolls She had stayed up late baking the night before, carefully arranging the serving dishes shaped like festive holly leaves and delicate snowflakes. By noon, the house was glowing with holiday cheer wreaths adorned the doors. Stockings hung expectantly by the fireplace. Candles flickered warmly on every windowsill, casting dancing shadows. The dining table was set perfectly, a masterpiece of tradition, down to the antique china she reserved for this one sacred meal each year. Each name card was handwritten in her elegant script, each gift selected and wrapped with an aching, almost desperate attention to detail. Helen had even purchased something extra special for Margaret this year, a delicate silver bracelet, simple and elegant, engraved with a small, meaningful quote they had shared since Margaret was a little girl. A phrase whispered between them during quiet moments. "Brave girl, strong heart." She wrapped it carefully, tying it with a luxurious red velvet ribbon, placing it in a small, velvet box. It wasn't flashy or expensive, not the kind of opulent gift Margaret often displayed or flaunted on social media. But it was deeply personal, imbued with history and meaningful connection. At precisely 3 p.m., the doorbell finally rang, its chime a cheerful sound that momentarily lifted Helen's spirits. Carla rushed in first, her arms laden with shopping bags filled with store-bought desserts she had clearly picked up on the way, barely acknowledging them as she set them on the counter. Henry followed closely behind, his eyes glued to his phone screen, seemingly preoccupied with something happening in the digital world. Margaret came in last, dressed casually, her own eyes also fixed on her screen as her fingers flew across the keyboard, lost in texting. Helen greeted each of them warmly, opening her arms and wrapping them in hugs that felt stiff, rushed, or noticeably distracted in return. She pushed down the small sting of disappointment each time and led them into the living room, inviting them to make themselves comfortable. "Everything looks beautiful, Mom," Carla said, her voice pleasant but absent-minded, her gaze sweeping over the festive decorations without truly seeming to see them. Dinner was a chaotic affair, a whirlwind of disconnected conversations, voices overlapping, inside jokes being shared that Helen wasn't a part of, comments about new TV shows she had never heard of, cultural references that flew over her head. She tried. She really did. To keep up, to follow the threads of conversation, to add a comment or a question. But every time she spoke, the dialogue seemed to shift away from her within seconds, as if her words somehow dissolved into the air before they even landed, leaving no trace. Still, she smiled, maintaining the facade of the perfect hostess, serving plates of food, refilling glasses, laughing politely, even when the jokes felt alienating, leaving her on the outside, looking in. After dessert had been served and mostly consumed, Helen reached under the twinkling Christmas tree, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous anticipation and hope. "Margaret," she called gently, holding out the small velvet box she had so carefully wrapped. "I found something for you. It's something special. I thought you might like it." Margaret, who had been scrolling through Instagram, barely looked up from her phone. She took the box with one hand, her movements quick and casual, flicked open the lid with her thumb, and stared down at the delicate bracelet nestled inside. A moment stretched between them, brittle and silent, thick with unspoken expectation. Then, Margaret let out a short, sharp snort of laughter. "A bracelet! Seriously! Grandma!" she said, her voice clear and loud, carrying across the room, audible to everyone. She tilted the small box toward her boyfriend, who peered inside with a knowing smirk that mirrored hers. "I mean, it's quaint," Margaret added, her voice dripping with condescending amusement, laughing lightly. "Guess you can't expect much. It's not like she knows what's cool anymore." The room erupted in an awkward, uncomfortable wave of forced chuckles and uneasy coughs. Carla attempted a weak attempt to shush her daughter, who quickly murmured, "Margaret, honestly." But the damage was already done, the cruel words hanging in the air. Even Henry, unable to meet Helen's eyes, looked down at his plate, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the intricate folds of his napkin. Helen sat perfectly still, the fixed, polite smile still plastered on her face, as fragile and unyielding as porcelain. Her hands, resting quietly in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly into fists. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a blush of humiliation and hurt. But she would not let them see it. She would not give them the satisfaction of knowing they had wounded her. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers brushing almost unconsciously against the soft fabric of her best red sweater, the one Benjamin had loved so much, the one she wore today, hoping, with a silent, desperate prayer, that he would have been proud of her strength, her resilience. The words Margaret had uttered replayed themselves in her head, each syllable sharper and more cutting than the last, carving a little deeper into her heart. "Seriously, Grandma," quaint, and the earlier devastating phrase, "useless." Helen suddenly felt absurd, a misplaced figure in her own home, like an outdated relic placed on a shelf for sentimental nostalgia, but utterly irrelevant to the vibrant, modern lives of the people surrounding her. She looked around the room at the faces of the children she had sacrificed so much for, the granddaughter she had cherished and prioritized above her own comfort or desires, and realized, with a stunning, gut-wrenching clarity, that they didn't see her anymore. Not the real her, not the woman who had poured her life into them. They didn't remember the countless nights she had stayed up late sewing elaborate Halloween costumes or fixing broken toys. They didn't remember the hours she had spent researching scholarships, helping them chase their academic dreams, the quiet ways she had helped keep their houses afloat during tough times, the heartbreaks she had silently nursed from the quiet solitude of the kitchen while stirring a pot of comforting soup, always ready to offer a listening ear or a shoulder to cry on. They remembered only convenience, only what she could provide, and now, only what she could seemingly no longer offer in their fast-paced modern world. Helen stood up slowly, deliberately, gathering a few plates from the table as a flimsy excuse to remove herself from the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. No one stopped her. No one asked if she needed help. No one followed. In the quiet sanctity of the kitchen, she set the dishes down in the sink, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. She walked to the window above the sink and stared out into the darkness, watching the snow fall softly under the warm glow of the porch light outside, silent, relentless, and pure. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the layers of hurt and disappointment, something fundamental shifted. It wasn't anger that bloomed. It was something colder, something quieter, something much more resolute. A profound decision, still nascent, began to take root in her soul. And though they were entirely unaware of it at that moment, that quiet, solitary instant in the kitchen was the precise point where Helen began the slow, deliberate process of leaving them behind. Helen finished meticulously stacking the few plates she had carried into the kitchen, wiping her hands slowly and deliberately on a dish towel as the faint buzz of voices from the dining room continued to reach her. A distant, muffled sound. She didn't rush back. There was no urgency, no expectation. They weren't waiting for her presence to resume their conversation or activities. From the corner of her eye, through the doorway, she saw Margaret hand the small velvet gift box containing the bracelet to her boyfriend. A gesture accompanied by another laugh, like a shared joke they both understood, but she was not meant to be a part of. Helen set the towel down neatly and walked quietly, deliberately, upstairs without saying a word, her steps light and purposeful on the familiar treads. She entered her bedroom and closed the door gently but firmly behind her, creating a space of solitude. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at her reflection in the large mirror on the wall. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized, a woman still dressed in her best clothes, specifically chosen for a family who no longer truly saw her. A woman still physically present, hosting a party for people who had long stopped valuing her invitations or appreciating her efforts. A woman still giving pieces of herself, her time, her energy, her love, to people who seemed to consider her an obligation, something they were required to tolerate, rather than a blessing, a source of unconditional love and support. In that profound silence, surrounded by the familiar objects of her private life, the decision solidified, yet clean, sharp, and irreversible. Helen pulled a small, well-worn suitcase from the back of her closet and placed it squarely on the bed. The action felt instinctive, like muscle memory honed by years of quiet preparation. She wasn't running away from them in anger or fleeing in shame. She wasn't seeking confrontation or demanding attention. She was simply choosing herself. Perhaps, she realized with a pang of surprise, for the very first time in decades. She packed slowly, methodically, her movements calm and deliberate. A few warm sweaters, comfortable walking shoes, a worn leather journal Benjamin had given her years ago, her toothbrush, a few essential toiletries, the essentials, and nothing more. She left the good jewelry where it was, nestled in velvet-lined drawers, the family heirlooms, passed down through generations, untouched. Let them have the material things they seem to care so much about. Let them, someday, if they chose to, divide it all amongst themselves, perhaps even squabbling over trinkets and possessions they had never truly valued, until they represented something lost. She found a plain piece of stationery on her bedside table and wrote a short, simple note. There was no emotional outpouring, no lengthy explanation, no guilt, no anger, no plea for understanding or reconciliation. It was brief, concise, and final. Thank you for dinner. Merry Christmas. Love, Mom. She left it clearly visible on the bedside table. By the time she returned downstairs, suitcase in hand, the family had dispersed from the dining room and were sprawled comfortably across the living room, their attention fragmented, eyes fixed on their phones, the television screen, or engaged in quiet conversation with each other. No one was looking towards the doorway. No one noticed her presence or lack thereof. She slipped her coat on, its familiar weight settling on her shoulders, grabbed her small suitcase, and walked deliberately towards the front door. No one saw her. No one called out. She paused for just a second, her hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob, taking one last, lingering look at the home she had poured her entire soul into for decades. The house that held the physical manifestation of her life's work and love. The memories, bitter, sweet, and heavy, hung in the air around her, thicker and more substantial than the festive decorations. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the mingled scents of cinnamon, pine, and something else. Something new and exhilarating. The scent of freedom. Then, with a quiet exhale, she stepped outside. The cold night air wrapped around her instantly, crisp and clean, feeling strangely like a baptism, a cleansing, a fresh start. The snow was falling more heavily now, silently blanketing the world in a pristine white layer, muffling sounds, creating a profound sense of quiet solitude. The wheels of her small suitcase left thin, temporary tracks on the snow-dusted driveway as she walked steadily towards the sidewalk, her steps firm and unwavering. She didn't know exactly where she was going yet, what her destination would be, but for the first time in years, the uncertainty of the future didn't fill her with terror. Instead, it thrilled her, a sense of possibility opening up before her. Behind her, the house glowed warmly, emanating a soft, inviting yellow light from its windows, a picture of domestic bliss. But it might as well have been a stranger's house, for all the genuine warmth and belonging it had offered her tonight. Helen kept walking, not hurried, not afraid, and most crucially, not broken. The woman who had hosted Christmas after Christmas, year after year, who had forgiven every slight, absorbed every disappointment, who had waited patiently for scraps of attention and validation. That woman stayed behind, within the brightly lit walls of the house. The one walking out into the snowy night was someone new, someone emerging, someone discovering their own wholeness independent of others. Helen didn't need a dramatic confrontation. She didn't need a tearful farewell scene. She didn't need their apologies, their sudden realizations, or their desperate pleas for her to return. They could keep their assumptions about who she was and what she needed. They could keep their stories that wrote her into a role she no longer wished to play. She had given them everything she possibly could. Her heart, her time, her resources. And it hadn't been enough to make them truly see her, to recognize her worth beyond her utility. Now, she would see herself, and she understood, with a quiet certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that finally, would be enough. At the corner of the street, where the familiar gave way to the unknown, Helen turned back for just a moment, a final, lingering look. The house stood quiet, unaware, bathed in its warm glow, unaware that it had just lost something utterly irreplaceable. Helen smiled softly, a genuine smile that reached her eyes this time, tucked her scarf tighter around her neck, and disappeared into the falling snow, stepping forward into her own unfolding story. Helen checked into a small, unpretentious inn just outside the town limits. The kind of place that felt steeped in a gentle past, with faded floral carpets in the hallways and curtains that looked like they had been chosen decades ago. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood polish, lingering dust, and perhaps a trace of coffee brewed hours earlier. She signed the guest book at the front desk with steady, unwavering hands, ignoring the brief, curious glance the young night clerk gave her. To him, she was simply another traveler, a transient figure needing a warm, temporary place to land on a cold winter's night. He handed her a key room 204, located on the second floor, at the very end of the hall. She rolled her small suitcase across the thin, worn carpet of the hallway. The sound surprisingly loud in the otherwise eerily quiet corridor. The only other noise the faint, low hum of a vending machine somewhere down the way. When she opened the door to her room, it greeted her with a profound sense of plainness and almost stark neutrality. Inside, there was a queen-sized bed neatly made, a small desk tucked into a corner, and a television set bolted securely to the wall. There were no wreaths, no festive lights, no hanging stockings. None of the comforting, familiar trappings of the holiday season she had just left behind. Just neutral-colored walls, functional furniture, and the slightly stale, unmoving air of a room that hosted temporary stays. Helen stood in the very center of the room for a long moment, her hands hanging loosely by her sides, feeling utterly suspended between the life she had left and the unknown future. She didn't cry. There were no overwhelming sobs, no angry outbursts of frustration or pain, just a deep, low ache that settled in her bones like a relentless winter chill that no amount of external warmth could seem to penetrate or fix. She walked slowly to the edge of the bed and sat down, the mattress dipping softly beneath her weight. For what felt like a very long while, she just stared at the wall across from her, her mind blessedly blank, not thinking, not planning, not processing, simply existing in the quiet, unadorned space. This, she realized with a sudden, sharp clarity, was rock bottom. Not because she was technically homeless. She knew she could go back to her house anytime she wanted. Knock on the door and re-enter the life she had departed. Not because she was without financial means. Benjamin, in his quiet wisdom, had ensured she had more than enough to live comfortably, even generously, for the rest of her life. No, it was rock bottom because, for the first time, Helen was forced to confront the devastating realization that her entire identity, her sense of self-worth, her purpose, had been meticulously built around being useful, needed, and valued by people who, in the end, no longer truly saw her worth. Without them, without Christmas dinners to painstakingly cook, without family emergencies to fix, without presents to carefully select and wrap, without traditions to uphold, who was she? A silent, anonymous nobody sitting alone in a rented room on Christmas night, the loneliest night of the year. At some point, feeling the cold seep into her, she pulled the heavy quilt from the bed and wrapped it around herself, still fully dressed in the clothes she had worn to host her family. The television in the corner droned quietly, playing an old black and white movie that seemed to be about hope and miracles. But she barely registered the images or the sound. The world outside the small window was completely blanketed in snow, pristine and still. The parking lot outside empty save for her small, familiar car. The minutes crawled by, stretching into long, slow hours. She thought about the past, about her life with Benjamin, about how fiercely and unconditionally she had loved him, about how hard they had fought, together, to build and nurture their little family. She thought about Margaret's tiny hands clutching her fingers, learning to walk, about Carla weeping on her shoulder, heartbroken and lost after her divorce, about Henry, young and broke, dropping by for Sunday dinners that were less about the food and more about the simple comfort of being in his mother's presence when he felt lonely. She thought about how easily, how seemingly effortlessly, they had drifted away, their visits becoming less frequent, their needs less urgent. Once they no longer seemed to need her to fix things for them, to be their safety net. The weight of loneliness in that small, unfamiliar room was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides, filling every empty corner. She closed her eyes tightly, pressing the heels of her hands against them, willing herself not to shatter completely, not to fall apart into a million irretrievable pieces. At some point during the long night, sleep finally came, but it was fitful, restless, disturbed by vivid dreams. She dreamed of Christmases past, of the house filled with warm, unforced laughter. Laughter that reached her, included her, made her feel part of something vibrant and real. She dreamed of Benjamin, alive and vibrant, pulling her unexpectedly into a joyful dance around the living room, their children laughing and clapping. The scene bathed in the magical glow of the Christmas lights. She woke with a sudden start just before dawn. The first pale, hesitant light of morning creeping through the narrow gap in the motel room curtains. Helen sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching from sleeping in her clothes, her heart feeling hollowed out, an empty echo chamber in her chest. The silence in the room was different now, heavier than the quiet of the night before. It wasn't the peaceful solitude she had perhaps imagined freedom would feel like. It was raw, cutting, undeniable emptiness. She stood up, moving stiffly, and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out. The world outside was a uniform expanse of white, quiet and still. No footprints marred the fresh, untouched snow. No cars moved along the road outside. The inn was tucked far enough away from town that even the distant Christmas lights, usually a source of cheer, seemed muted, far off, belonging to a different, distant world. Helen rested her forehead against the cold window pane, the glass chilling her skin. The girl she had once been. The one who had believed with unwavering certainty that love alone was a powerful enough force to hold a family together, to conquer all challenges, was gone. The woman staring out at the frozen landscape, at the still, white world, was someone else now. Someone who had endured a profound loss. Someone who perhaps had nothing left to lose, in the conventional sense. It wasn't just the painful loss of her family's affection and attention that weighed on her. It was the crushing loss of the very identity she had built for herself in relation to them. The bitter, dawning realization that they had simply moved on without her, no longer needing the person she had been. It was the devastating understanding that love, when taken for granted for too long, consistently neglected and unappreciated, could quietly, almost imperceptibly, fade and transform into something colder, something that felt suspiciously like mere obligation, or perhaps even resentment. Helen drew a slow, deep breath. watching her breath fog up a small patch of the cold glass before her. She traced a small heart on the condensation with the tip of her finger, watching it disappear almost immediately, dissolving back into the moisture on the pane. Gone, she thought, just like so many of the things she had clung to, so desperately, for so long. For the first time in her life, she faced a future that was entirely hers, and hers alone, to build. There was no pre-existing roadmap, no prescribed role to fill, no one to answer to, just her. And though the idea, in its vastness, terrified her, somewhere deep within the rubble of the identity she had lost, within the quiet devastation, a tiny ember stirred. It was fragile, easily extinguished. But it was there. She wasn't ready yet to fan that ember into a flame. But she knew, with a quiet certainty, that soon she would be. Morning broke slowly and gray, matching the somber mood that still clung to the edges of the world. Helen dressed in silence, pulling on the same clothes she had worn the day before. The red sweater that now felt like a costume from a life that was fading. She braided her silver-streaked hair neatly down her back, smoothing stray wisps with careful, automatic fingers. A small act of putting herself together despite the internal disarray. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a world of blinding white, still and silent, stretching endlessly in every direction, vast and empty. She truly didn't know what to do next. There was no plan, solidified, no destination firmly decided upon. Only the aching, undeniable awareness that the door to her old life, the one she had known and nurtured for decades, had quietly, definitively closed behind her. At the checkout counter of the inn, the young clerk barely looked up as Helen slid her room key across the desk. He mumbled a polite, automatic, "Merry Christmas," without meeting her eyes, his gaze already fixed on the next task. Helen thanked him anyway, pulling her coat tighter against the biting cold as she stepped outside into the quiet morning air. Instead of turning her car towards home, towards the familiar neighborhood and the house that no longer felt entirely her own, she turned in the opposite direction, almost without conscious thought, as if guided by an unseen force. She drove towards the small cemetery on the edge of town, nestled amongst rolling hills, a place of quiet rest. It wasn't until she pulled into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching loudly against the frozen ground, that she fully realized where her heart, her intuition, had been leading her to Benjamin's grave. She hadn't been there since autumn, when the leaves on the trees had turned fiery shades of red and gold, and the air still smelled faintly of harvest and home. She had promised herself she would visit on Christmas Eve, a quiet tradition between them. But life, or what she had convinced herself was life, the demands of hosting and preparing for a family that no longer truly valued her presence, had gotten in the way. Now, finally, it was time. Helen walked carefully across the frozen earth of the cemetery, her boots leaving shallow, temporary prints in the fresh snow. The cemetery was deserted, utterly still, the rows of simple, dignified stones dusted with snow, looking like forgotten monuments to lives once lived. She found Benjamin's grave near the old, sturdy oak tree they had often sat under during visits. The headstone simple and dignified, just the way he would have wanted it. She knelt slowly, brushing the snow away from the inscription with her gloved hand, tracing his name, Benjamin Bennett, with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, Walt," she whispered into the brittle winter air, her voice catching. "I should have come yesterday. I should have seen things sooner." The wind stirred gently around her, lifting the hem of her coat, whipping stray strands of hair across her face. But Helen stayed kneeling there, grounding herself in the cold earth, clinging to the only piece of her past life that still felt entirely solid, entirely real, after a long while, lost in quiet communion. She sat back on her heels and noticed something tucked carefully behind the base of the headstone. Something she hadn't seen during previous visits. Something partially hidden by the snow. It was a battered leather binder. At first, she thought someone else must have left it there by mistake. A forgotten possession. But when she reached out and picked it up, her fingers brushing against the worn leather, she saw her name embossed faintly on the front cover, almost invisible with age, Helen Bennett. Frowning slightly, a sense of bewilderment mingling with curiosity. She opened it carefully. The pages inside were yellowed with time but neatly organized, filled with rows of documents, meticulously written notes, and carefully preserved letters. Her breath caught in her throat as she flipped through them. Benjamin's unmistakable handwriting was everywhere. Careful, looping, familiar. Deeds to properties she hadn't even known he had quietly purchased years ago. Secure investment accounts she had long forgotten about or perhaps never even been fully aware of. Life insurance policies naming her as the sole, unconditional beneficiary. Untouched trust funds, protected and growing over time. Benjamin, in his quiet, unassuming way, had spent years building something for her. Steadily, carefully, without fanfare or expectation. Never saying a word about it because that was simply the kind of man he had been. Private, selfless, fiercely devoted to her well-being. He had known, with a foresight that humbled her, that she might need it one day. He had trusted her, implicitly, to know when the time was right to claim it, to use it for her own future. Tears welled in Helen's eyes, not from sadness or sorrow, but from a fierce, overwhelming swell of being seen, truly seen, even after all this time, after his passing. It was the powerful, yes, healing sensation of being loved without conditions, without demands, without the need to prove her worth. She turned to the very back of the binder, where a handwritten letter was tucked carefully into a plastic sleeve, as if for safekeeping. She pulled it out gently, unfolding the aged paper. Benjamin's familiar script filled the page. "My dearest Helen," it began, "you gave your whole heart and soul to this family, unstintingly, year after year. If there ever comes a time, my love, when you need to start over, when you need to build a new life entirely on your own terms, a life that is truly yours, I want you to have everything you need to do it without fear or hardship. Love builds. You built our life, our family, our future with your unwavering love and sacrifice. Now this. This is yours. It is always yours, to use however you need, whenever you need. Always yours. Walt." Helen pressed the letter against her chest, clutching the binder tightly, feeling Benjamin's words like a steady, comforting heartbeat against her own. He had known. He had seen, perhaps long before she did, the subtle ways love could turn into indifference, How profound sacrifice could be taken for granted. How her own light might be dimmed by the expectations of others. He had trusted her with this precious gift, not to waste her life waiting for people who no longer truly valued what she offered, not to stay in a place where she was no longer seen. In that transformative moment, kneeling in the cold snow beside his grave, with the heavy binder clutched against her heart, Helen felt something inside her shift again, something fundamental and irreversible. This wasn't an ending, it was, she realized with breathtaking clarity, a beginning, a profound, unexpected beginning. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff and numb from the cold. But her spirit felt lighter, steadier, stronger than it had felt in months, perhaps even years. Helen tucked the binder carefully under her arm, pressing a final, silent kiss against Benjamin's name on the stone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She turned back towards her car, walking away from the grave, leaving fresh footprints behind her in the undisturbed snow, but carrying something infinitely more valuable with her. Now, not just financial security, not just material wealth, but the tangible proof of Benjamin's enduring love and, more importantly, the profound gift of freedom. And for the first time in longer than she could possibly remember, Helen smiled, not for anyone else's benefit, not a brittle, polite smile, but a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile solely for herself. Helen drove slowly back towards town, her hands steady on the steering wheel, the worn leather binder sitting safely on the passenger seat beside her, a tangible symbol of her new path. For the first time in days, no, she realized, for the first time in years, her mind wasn't buzzing with the endless, exhausting list of things she felt obligated to do for others. There was no running mental tally of meals to cook, gifts to wrap, apologies to craft in her head, or ways to make herself smaller, quieter, more accommodating to fit into the shrinking space her family allowed her. There was just a quiet voice inside her, a voice that was growing steadily louder, asking a question she hadn't dared to pose to herself in decades. "What do you want, Helen?" It was a question that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Helen pulled into a small park she used to bring Carla and Henry to when they were little, a place filled with happier, simpler memories. It was nearly empty now in the winter chill. Just a few patches of snow, slowly turning to slush along the winding paths. She parked her car under a bare oak tree, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long moment in the stillness, surrounded by the quiet echoes of the past. She opened the binder again, running her fingertips lightly over the pages, the numbers, the legal letters, the quiet accumulation of Benjamin's foresight, the vast landscape of possibilities it represented. Benjamin had left her more than money, more than security. He had left her the powerful reminder that she was allowed to dream beyond the narrow role others had, consciously or unconsciously, confined her to. Helen closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time, to truly picture it a life built entirely on her own terms, guided by her own desires and needs. Maybe a little cottage nestled near the coast, where the sea breeze would lift the light curtains at the windows and fill the rooms with the clean, invigorating scent of salt and the warmth of the sun. Maybe quiet morning walks to a small, independent bakery for fresh bread. Afternoons spent painting again, a hobby she had loved and been good at, but had abandoned when the demands of raising children and managing a household consumed all her time and energy. Maybe evenings spent surrounded by books, listening to music, finding a profound sense of peace and solitude. Not once in this unfolding daydream did the picture include pleading for Margaret's elusive approval, or anxiously waiting for Carla to return her calls, or hoping Henry would remember to include her in his family gatherings. Not once did it involve begging for a seat at a table where she clearly no longer belonged. Helen let the daydream expand, taking on form and substance, until it no longer felt like a distant, impossible fantasy. It felt like a real, tangible choice she could make, a future she could actively build. A tiny, fragile flicker of joy, delicate but undeniably real, sparked within her chest, spreading a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't finished. She wasn't useless, as Margaret had so carelessly, so thoughtlessly thrown out. She had simply been pouring all her light, her energy, her love into people who had long stopped reaching for its warmth, who had grown accustomed to its presence without acknowledging its source. Now, she understood. She would turn that light back inward, nurturing her own needs, her own growth. A memory surfaced, something Benjamin used to say with a gentle smile when the children were teenagers, navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence, slamming doors and rolling their eyes in classic teenage fashion. Don't water dead plants. Find something that grows with you. She smiled at the thought of him, at his quiet wisdom and unwavering support. He would have been furious, she knew, to witness the careless way she had been treated. But more than that, he would have been profoundly sad. She suspected to see how long she had stayed, how long she had tried to fix something that had already withered, pouring her precious life force into a connection that was no longer reciprocal. Helen pulled out a small notepad from her purse, the same one she had used for years to jot down grocery lists, reminders for family birthdays, and other mundane tasks, and flipped to a clean, blank page. At the very top, she wrote in firm, deliberate script, "What I want." The words looked strange and bold, sitting alone on the pristine white page, a declaration unlike any she had ever made. She tapped the pen gently against her chin, thinking, feeling the old, ingrained patterns of duty, obligation, and guilt tugging at her, trying to pull her back. She almost wrote, "Keep trying with family," the automatic response of a lifetime of prioritizing others. But her hand froze, poised above the paper. No, she reminded herself firmly. This list wasn't for them. This list, this intention, was solely for her. Slowly, deliberately, she began to write, the pen scratching softly against the paper. Live by the water, plant a garden, feel the earth in my hands, learn to paint again, capture the colors of the sea and sky, take a cooking class, just for fun, for myself. Host new friends for tea, people who see me, laugh freely, without wondering if it's appropriate or if I'm being too loud. Sleep in on Sundays, simply because I can. Say yes to new things without fear or hesitation. Say no without guilt or explanation. Each line she wrote felt like opening a window that had been nailed shut for too long, letting in fresh air and light. She didn't know exactly how or when she would make it all happen. the practical steps required to translate these desires into reality, but the simple act of claiming them, of putting them into ink, made them feel real, possible, within her reach. She folded the notepad closed, tucking it safely into her coat pocket like a precious treasure. She looked up at the pale winter sky. The clouds were beginning to break, shafts of soft, hesitant light piercing through, promising that nothing, not even the coldest, longest season, lasted forever. Helen started the car again, the engine humming with a quiet, steady strength that seemed to mirror her own newfound resolve. She wasn't going back to the house. She wasn't going back to the role they had written for her, the one she had played for so long. She was moving forward, and for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't asking for anyone's permission. Helen didn't announce her plans to anyone. There were no long, emotional conversations, no tearful speeches explaining her decision, no final, desperate pleadings for understanding or change. She moved quietly, methodically, like a woman laying the bricks of a new foundation under the cover of night, building her future without the scrutiny or potential interference of others. The first thing she did, shortly after that quiet Christmas, was visit her lawyer, an old and trusted friend of Benjamin's named Mr. Halverson. He was a man with kind eyes that held a depth of understanding and a sharp, discerning mind. His office, located in a quiet building downtown, smelled reassuringly of worn leather and old books, the walls lined with framed certificates that testified to decades of careful, loyal work on behalf of his clients. He greeted her warmly, rising from his desk to offer her a comfortable chair and a freshly brewed cup of coffee. "Helen Bennett," he said with a genuine smile. "It's certainly been too long. Please, sit. Tell me, what can I do for you today?" Helen placed Benjamin's battered leather binder on his large, polished desk and, with steady, unwavering hands, slid the updated documents, the deeds, the account summaries, the policy details, across the surface toward him. "I need to make some changes, Mr. Halverson," she said calmly, her voice clear and resolute. "Some significant changes. Big ones." They spent the better part of an hour reviewing her assets, the value of the property, the carefully nurtured stocks, the life insurance policies, the various savings accounts Benjamin had quietly and diligently grown over the years, ensuring her financial security. Mr. Halverson listened intently, without judgment or surprise, as Helen outlined her wishes, detailing the new direction she wanted her legacy to take. She wanted her will, the document that dictated the distribution of her life's accumulated wealth, rewritten entirely. Her original plans, which designated equal shares of her estate to Carla and Henry, with a special fund set aside specifically for Margaret's future education and needs, were erased, replaced by a new vision. In their place, Helen established two new primary beneficiaries. One was a local scholarship fund dedicated to providing full tuition grants to disadvantaged young people from the community who possessed drive and potential, but lacked the financial means to attend college on their own. The second beneficiary was an individual, someone entirely outside her immediate family, someone they had never heard of. When Mr. Halverson discreetly asked for details about this unexpected choice, Helen smiled gently, a soft, knowing smile. "I met a young woman recently," she explained. "Her name is Ellie Monroe. She's studying nursing, works 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And despite all the hardship, she is always kind, genuinely kind, even to complete strangers." Helen had met Ellie the previous year at the local hospital when she had taken a fall and badly sprained her wrist, requiring a trip to the emergency room. Ellie, who was working as a student volunteer at the time, had sat with Helen for hours, chatting, fetching ice packs, offering comfort, treating her not as an elderly burden or just another patient, but as a person worthy of care and attention. It had been a fleeting kindness, a brief encounter in the vast landscape of her life, but it had stayed with Helen, a quiet beacon of humanity. Kindness mattered, she realized. Character mattered more than blood ties. Proximity did not guarantee loyalty, respect, or reciprocal love. By the end of their meeting, the comprehensive paperwork was complete, the new will legally drafted and signed. "Mr. Halverson shook her hand firmly across the desk, his gaze steady and searching. "You are absolutely sure about this, Helen?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of concern for the magnitude of her decision. "I'm sure," she said, her voice stronger and more certain than it had sounded in years. "I want the love I leave behind, the resources accumulated through a lifetime of effort and sacrifice, to grow somewhere it is truly wanted, somewhere it can make a real, meaningful difference." The next few days unfolded with quiet, deliberate precision. Helen contacted a trusted real estate agent and arranged for her home to be quietly appraised, the first step in preparing to put it on the market. She told no one in her family, not Carla, not Henry. Let them remain unaware, still believing she was perhaps somewhere, quietly mourning the empty seats at her Christmas table, still waiting, still hoping. She began the process of sorting through her possessions, not with sadness or regret, but with a profound sense of liberation, of shedding layers that no longer fit, clothes she no longer wore, items that had simply accumulated over time, donated to local charities, family heirlooms, pieces she had once imagined carefully passing down to her children and grandchildren, boxed and labeled for charity auctions, allowing their value, whatever it was, to benefit others. Trinkets, dusty mementos, things that held only the weight of a past that was no longer serving her, discarded without ceremony. Helen kept only the true essentials, the items imbued with real, personal meaning. A few cherished photo albums capturing moments of genuine happiness. Benjamin's worn fishing hat, her mother's delicate locket, a small collection of books that had weathered the passage of time alongside her. Each box she packed, each shelf she cleared, felt like a physical and emotional lightening, a step forward on her new path. She began spending her afternoons in the quiet sanctuary of the town library, immersed in research. She devoured books and brochures about coastal towns, small, peaceful communities nestled by the sea, places where she could potentially build a quieter, richer, more fulfilling life. Somewhere new, somewhere she could be known not primarily as mom or grandma or the one who always hosts the holidays, but simply as Helen, a woman charting her own course. She found herself smiling more frequently, not because someone expected her to maintain a cheerful facade, but because the very act of reclaiming her future, of making choices for herself, tasted sweet and sharp on her tongue, a flavor of freedom. Meanwhile, back in their own lives, Carla and Henry and Margaret, Helen's absence was noted, but only in passing at first. A missed call here, a forgotten text message there. They were too deeply engrossed in the immediate demands and distractions of their own lives to truly notice the quiet, tectonic shift that was slowly but surely taking place beneath their feet, the ground subtly moving away from beneath them. Helen didn't resent them for it anymore. The sharp sting had dulled into a quiet understanding, perhaps even a touch of pity. She saw them clinging to their rushed, shallow lives, unaware that the strong, steady woman they had once leaned on without offering thanks, the constant presence they had taken for granted, had stopped waiting for them to notice her value, had simply walked away. The final step in her departure was, perhaps, the hardest, though not in the way she might once have expected. One evening, Helen sat by the fireplace in her living room, the house dim and quiet, illuminated only by the dancing flicker of the flames. She opened a fresh envelope and carefully penned a few final letters, not explanations, not apologies for her actions, just simple, heartfelt notes addressed to her children and grandchild. "I love you," she wrote to each of them. "I hope someday you understand why I had to do this. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, find kindness in the world, and hold on to it fiercely." She sealed them, placing each one, addressed but not mailed, into a small, intricately carved wooden box that Benjamin had made for her on their 5th wedding anniversary. The box would remain in the house until it was sold, a silent message left behind. If they ever came looking for answers, for understanding, they would find them there, quiet, dignified, and utterly final. Helen stood up, stretching her back, feeling the familiar stiffness of age, but also, surprisingly, the strength that came with it, the resilience forged by a lifetime of challenges. Her life, she realized, was no longer a slow, sad decline into being forgotten, a gradual fading into invisibility. It was a deliberate, conscious, graceful departure into something entirely new, something she was building solely for herself. And she didn't need anyone's permission, anyone's validation, to begin. The first real cracks in her family's seemingly solid world appeared sooner than Helen might have expected, though she was no longer present to witness them firsthand. At first, they were small, almost invisible fractures, like tiny hairline fissures beneath the surface of a frozen lake. But once they began, they spread faster and more unpredictably than anyone could have stopped them. It started with the Christmas leftovers, a small, domestic detail that suddenly loomed large in Helen's absence. Carla called one evening, leaving a rushed, slightly breathless voicemail message. "Hey, Mom, we have a ton of food left from Christmas dinner. Thought maybe you'd want some to take home. Call me back." Helen listened to the message much later, sitting in a cozy, sun-drenched corner of a cafe in her new coastal town, sipping a cup of fragrant tea and leisurely flipping through colorful brochures for local gardening clubs and art classes. She smiled faintly, a small, knowing smile that was solely for herself, set her phone down on the table, and didn't call back. She knew exactly what that call was not a genuine gesture of love or concern for her well-being, but a clumsy, half-hearted attempt to re-establish connection, a way to subtly tether her back to the life, the role she had quietly but firmly stepped away from. It was guilt masked as generosity. Next came Henry. A week or so after the new year, he sent her a text message. "You okay? Mom haven't heard from you." Helen read the message carefully. It wasn't a real question, not the kind born of deep worry or genuine yearning for connection. It was the kind of question you ask when you're checking a box, fulfilling a minimal obligation, a sense of duty rather than a true desire to connect. She put the phone down again, leaving the message unanswered. At first, the silence created by Helen's deliberate withdrawal seemed to go largely unnoticed by her family. They were busy, preoccupied with their own lives, their own routines, their own problems. But as winter dragged on, stretching into cold, gray weeks, the weight of Helen's absence began to settle heavily into the spaces she used to effortlessly fill. Carla found herself unexpectedly having to scramble to organize Sunday dinners, feeling a strange, unsettling hollowness when no one else volunteered to host or contribute. Henry realized, with a jolt of surprise, that he hadn't seen a homemade pie, received a hand-knitted scarf for his birthday, or opened a single handwritten card in months. Margaret, who continued to post glossy, carefully curated pictures of nights out with friends and spontaneous tropical vacations on social media, discovered that when she came home to visit, the house felt colder, emptier, lacking the invisible warmth Helen had always provided. They had lost something essential, something vital, and they didn't even realize how much until it was completely gone. Helen, meanwhile, moved through her days with a growing, quiet strength, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She met regularly with her realtor, finalizing the myriad details required to put her house officially on the market. She continued to tour small seaside towns, imagining her future life unfolding there, days spent with her hands in the rich earth of a garden, evenings filled with music, books, and the company of new friends who would know her as she was now, not simply as a repository of past favors and forgotten traditions. With every passing week, the shift in her life, the profound change she had initiated, became more tangible, more real. In the family group chat, that digital space where Helen's cheerful messages and thoughtful inquiries had once helped keep the rhythm of their connection alive, conversations dwindled. Plans for future gatherings became increasingly half-hearted, rarely solidifying. Holidays, once bustling with noise, shared meals, and cherished traditions, now felt like empty obligations, hollow echoes of what they used to be. Helen's absence had pulled a crucial, foundational thread from the tightly woven fabric of their family unit, and now the whole thing sagged, weakened, under its own weight. Carla called again on a chilly Sunday afternoon, her voice tight with frustration and a burgeoning sense of panic when Helen didn't answer. "Mom, I don't know where you are or what's going on," she said into the voicemail, her voice rising slightly. "But we miss you. Please call me." "Okay, we need to talk." Helen listened to the voicemail later that day while sitting on a bench overlooking the vast, restless ocean near a lighthouse on the coast. The salty air stung her cheeks, and the constant, rhythmic sound of the waves filled her ears, a soothing counterpoint to the anxiety in Carla's voice. She thought about calling back. For a long moment, she considered it, the old habits of comforting and reassuring her children pulling at her. But then she realized, with profound clarity, that they didn't miss her, the whole, complex woman who had given them everything. They missed the version of her that asked for nothing in return, the version that tirelessly gave everything, the one who was always available, always forgiving, always there to fix things. They missed the convenience of her unconditional love and constant presence, not the reality of her soul. And Helen, for the very first time, truly understood her own value. Wasn't something she had to constantly prove, earn, or beg for. It simply was, inherent and unwavering. She tucked her phone away and watched the sun begin its slow descent below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of gold, orange, and deep crimson. Helen wasn't angry anymore. The anger, she knew, would have tethered her to them just as tightly as guilt had. She felt something purer, something much more liberating, a fierce, quiet peace, a certainty that she was no longer tied to a place or to people where she was fundamentally unseen, unvalued. At the same time, the balance of power within the family had irrevocably shifted. Helen was no longer the invisible anchor, the one tirelessly holding everyone together, bearing the emotional weight. They were left, perhaps for the first time, to reckon with their own fractured bonds, their own patterns of neglect, their own suddenly hollowed-out traditions. And Helen, she wasn't standing still, frozen in place, desperately hoping for them to finally notice her. She was moving forward, quietly, steadily, into a life where love wasn't a transactional exchange, a service rendered, but something mutual, freely given, freely received, a bond built on respect and genuine connection. And the farther she walked from the heavy expectations they had chained her to for so long, the lighter she became, the stronger her own spirit grew. Spring crept into town quietly, hesitantly at first, gradually melting the last stubborn patches of snow, breathing new, vibrant life into the barren trees that lined the streets. As the days grew longer and warmer, filled with the promise of renewal, word began to spread through the family, filtering through hushed phone calls and tentative text messages. Helen's house was officially for sale. At first, the news didn't cause widespread alarm. It was mentioned offhandedly during a rushed phone call between Carla and Henry. "Mom probably just needs a smaller place," Carla said, trying to convince herself as much as her brother. "Something easier to manage now that she's older. It makes sense." But deep down, beneath the surface of their casual dismissal, a seed of unease had been planted, and it began to fester. They hadn't genuinely seen Helen since that difficult Christmas Day dinner. Not once. No dinner invitations had been extended. No holiday plans had been shared. No casual Sunday brunches had materialized. She hadn't been present at Easter, hadn't called on their birthdays, hadn't dropped by unexpectedly with her famous homemade pies or a carefully knitted scarf. They had pushed her into the background for so long, had grown so accustomed to her being a quiet, reliable fixture in their lives, that when she finally, decisively, stepped out of the frame, they were left blinking into the sudden, empty space where she had been, unsure of what to do, when the "For Sale" sign actually appeared on the front lawn of Helen's long-familiar house, officially listed on the market, a palpable sense of panic began to set in. That's when the invitations, previously non-existent, suddenly started arriving, delivered via text messages and voicemails, tentative and laced with a newfound urgency. A text from Carla. "Hey, Mom. Thinking of doing a Mother's Day brunch next month. Hope you can make it. Let me know." A voicemail from Henry. "Mom. Hey. It's Henry. We should do a family cookout soon. It's been too long. Give me a call." Even Margaret, who had barely glanced at Helen during that awful Christmas dinner, who had dismissed her so cruelly, sent a sheepish, almost hesitant, direct message. "Miss you, Grandma. Things are weird without you. Let's get coffee soon." Helen smiled softly at each message as it arrived. Not cruelly, not bitterly, not with a desire for revenge, but simply with the quiet, profound smile of someone who finally, truly, understood her place, her value, and the dynamics of the relationships that had defined her for so long. She answered none of them immediately. Instead, she waited. She waited until she had finalized everything, the sale of the house, the detailed paperwork for the donation to the scholarship fund she had established, the final legal signatures transferring her assets according to her new will. Only then, one bright, sunny spring afternoon, did she agree to meet them. She chose a small cafe downtown for the meeting. Nothing too grand or sentimental. Just neutral ground. A public space that felt appropriate for an ending. A clearing of the air. They arrived before she did, clustering awkwardly around a table by the window, looking tense and unsure of themselves. Carla fussed nervously with the sugar packets on the table. Henry stared intently at his phone, avoiding eye contact. Margaret, restless and bored, snapped a quick selfie, projecting an air of detachment she clearly didn't feel. When Helen entered the cafe, composed and serene, carrying nothing but her purse, they looked up with rehearsed smiles and tentative waves, a little too eager, a little too half-forced, clearly unsure of how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. She walked calmly to the table and took a seat directly across from them, setting her purse down carefully in her lap, her posture radiating a quiet strength and composure. There were no initial hugs, no genuine "we missed yous" that felt authentic, just nervous energy and forced pleasantries. "Mom," Carla began, forcing a bright, cheerful tone that sounded hollow. "We're so glad you could meet with us. We've all been worried about you." Helen simply nodded politely, her expression calm. "I'm fine," she said, her voice even and steady. Henry leaned in slightly, his voice lowered, adopting a tone of concern mixed with accusation. "We heard about the house," he said. "Selling it. You should have talked to us first. Mom, we could have helped." Helen's eyebrows lifted slightly, a subtle gesture that conveyed more than words. "Helped with what, Henry?" she asked gently, her tone deceptively mild. There was a pause, an uncomfortable silence, the kind that falls when people are fumbling for words that don't sound nakedly selfish or entitled. Margaret broke it first, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Well, you know, selling it is a big decision, Grandma. That house it's part of the family. It holds all our memories. Helen folded her hands neatly in her lap, her gaze calm and steady as she looked from one face to the next. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it held an unyielding strength. "I spent 40 years making that house a home," she said quietly. "It's part of my life, my effort, my memories. Not yours." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and immovable. A truth they hadn't considered or acknowledged. Carla cleared her throat, trying a different tactic, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "Of course, Mom, we know that," she said quickly. "But what about the inheritance? You always said you wanted to leave the house to us. You know, for the kids, for the family, for the future generations." Helen smiled, a real smile this time, one that held a quiet satisfaction, steel beneath the kindness. "I did say that once," she acknowledged. Margaret leaned forward eagerly, a flicker of her usual entitlement returning to her eyes. "So, we're still good. Right, everything still. Planned." Helen looked at each of them in turn again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her point without needing to raise her voice or resort to anger. "I've updated my will," she said, her tone clear, unwavering, devoid of emotion. "The house is sold. The proceeds are being donated to a scholarship fund for young people who need it. The remainder of my estate will go to someone who showed me kindness when no one else bothered to." Their faces shifted in stages. A cascade of reactions, initial confusion, followed quickly by disbelief, and finally, raw, undisguised outrage and shock. You're cutting us out," Carla said, her voice cracking, betraying her shock. "No," Helen said simply, calmly. "You cut yourselves out years ago. I'm just making it official. I'm aligning my legacy with where my love and respect are genuinely reciprocated." Henry pushed back his chair roughly, scraping it loudly against the floor, as if the discomfort, the truth of her words, was too much to bear. Margaret gaped at her grandmother, the entitled shine fading from her eyes, replaced by stunned disbelief. Helen rose slowly, smoothly, smoothing her coat as she prepared to leave. "I didn't come here to argue or justify myself," she said quietly, her voice still steady. "I came to say goodbye properly, to explain my decision face to face, not through lawyers or letters." She placed a small, plain envelope on the table, 3 identical notes inside, one for each of them, sealed with the same finality as her words. No accusations, no venom, just a quiet, dignified ending. They sat frozen, stunned into silence, as she walked calmly out of the cafe and into the bright, hopeful spring air. No shouting, no tearful pleas, just clarity and finality, and as the door swung shut behind her, the small bell above it tinkling softly. Helen felt lighter than she had in decades, as if an immense weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The days that followed the cafe meeting were strangely quiet. Helen expected anger, perhaps even furious phone calls, accusations, attempts to guilt her into changing her mind or reconsidering her decision. But what she received instead was silence, the stunned, echoing kind that follows a seismic shift. The silence that descends when people suddenly realize the ground beneath them has given way, and no one is coming to pull them back up to stable footing. She went on with her plans, undisturbed, Her house sale closed smoothly, quickly. The substantial funds from the sale were safely transferred into the accounts she had carefully arranged with Mr. Halverson, her trustworthy lawyer. The scholarship fund, officially named the Benjamin and Helen Bennett Foundation, was formally launched. Its mission to offer full tuition grants to hardworking young students who possessed potential and drive, but lacked the financial resources to attend college on their own. It was the kind of legacy Helen was truly proud to leave behind. Not dusty, unused heirlooms or empty symbolic gestures, but tangible opportunity, the potential for growth, and genuine hope for deserving young people. And then came the final, unexpected twist. Helen had specifically requested that the official public announcement about the establishment of the Benjamin and Helen Bennett Foundation be timed perfectly, released just days after her move to the coast was complete. Once she was settled in her new life, she didn't plan to witness the immediate fallout firsthand. She didn't need to. She was already sitting peacefully on the small porch of her new home, a cozy cottage overlooking the endless, shimmering blue of the Atlantic Ocean, the salty air invigorating her senses. When Carla called, her name flashing on Helen's phone screen, Helen simply let it ring, the sound fading into the background noise of the waves. She could easily imagine the scene: Carla, perhaps opening the local newspaper over her morning coffee, seeing the full-page announcement with a beaming, dignified photo of Helen, not as grandma or mom, but as a philanthropist, a benefactor, a woman of substance whose quiet generosity would now flow not to those who had dismissed her, mocked her, or forgotten her, but to complete strangers, young dreamers who would carry her legacy forward with gratitude, respect, and a renewed sense of possibility. The phone buzzed again. A text message this time. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk." Helen smiled softly and set the phone down on the small table beside her, leaving the message unanswered, focusing on the calming rhythm of the ocean. Later that afternoon, another text arrived, this one from Henry. "I can't believe you would do this to us." The words, once capable of inflicting deep pain, didn't hurt anymore. They seemed to roll off her like water off a smooth stone. She realized then, with a profound sense of freedom, how often guilt and obligation had been used like a leash, subtly but effectively keeping her tethered, keeping her serving, forgiving, bending herself to fit their expectations. But Helen wasn't carrying that heavy weight anymore. She had deliberately laid it down the day she chose herself, the day she decided her own well-being mattered. The final message came from Margaret. No anger, no outrage, just a single, short, seemingly desperate sentence. "Why, Grandma, I thought you loved us." Helen stared at the screen for a long time, the words hanging in the digital space. She thought about that difficult Christmas dinner, about the laughter that wasn't meant for her ears, the careless cruelty of her words, the years of slow, subtle erasure. She thought about the fundamental difference between loving someone deeply and unconditionally, and allowing them to consistently take your love for granted, to treat you with disrespect and indifference. Helen typed a reply carefully, deliberately, without bitterness, without venom, stating her truth simply and clearly. "I do love you, Margaret. I always will. Fiercely, and unconditionally. But love doesn't mean staying where you're not valued, where your heart is not seen. She hit send and placed the phone face down on the small table beside her, letting the digital echoes of the past fade away. Above her, seagulls wheeled effortlessly through the vast, cloudless sky, free and untethered, mirroring the feeling in her own soul. In the distance, on the beach below, a group of children laughed, their bright kites soaring high against the brilliant blue. Life, she knew, moved forward, with or without permission, with or without the approval of others. Helen leaned back in her chair, feeling the gentle sea breeze lift her hair, carrying with it the last lingering whispers of the life she had left behind. She hadn't lost anything truly valuable, she realized. She had simply set herself free from expectations, from obligations that had become burdens, from a role that no longer fit. And in doing so, in stepping away from what was expected, she had found something infinitely greater and more profound than the hollow echoes of obligation and tradition. She had found herself whole, complete, and finally, truly free. The weeks drifted by, soft and unhurried, carrying Helen gently forward. She settled into her new life by the sea like a ship finding calm, safe waters after navigating a long, violent storm. Her days were slow, peaceful, and wonderfully full, dictated by her own rhythms and desires. There were quiet morning walks along the shoreline, the cool sand a comforting presence beneath her feet. Afternoons were spent at the local town library, losing herself in books, or by the window in her cottage, painting, filling blank canvases with vibrant colors and bold, sweeping lines that reflected the newfound freedom and joy in her spirit. Evenings were simple, often spent by the fire with a book, or working on a painting half finished on the easel by the window. The sounds of the ocean a constant, soothing backdrop. She no longer waited anxiously for calls or messages. She didn't check her phone with a knot of nervous hope in her chest, silently praying for a sign of connection from her family. She simply lived quietly, contentedly, building a life filled with intentional presence and simple pleasures. She had joined a local gardening club, her hands finding comfort and purpose once again in the cool, rich earth, coaxing life from tiny seeds, watching things grow and flourish under her care. She took painting classes every Tuesday afternoon, discovering a hidden talent and a deep well of creative joy. She made new friends, true friends, people she met through her hobbies and interests, people who liked her not for what she could do for them, but simply for who she was, for the quiet warmth and wisdom she carried, for the way she smiled when she was truly happy, for the first time, asking for nothing from anyone. Every so often, she received a letter from Carla or Margaret, tentative updates, small acts of reaching out across the distance she had created. Helen read each one with an open heart, but a steady, unwavering mind. She answered when she felt like it, offering encouragement without making promises she couldn't keep, sharing small pieces of her life without surrendering the privacy and peace she had found. She hoped they were growing, that they were building better lives for themselves, fostering better relationships built on mutual respect. But she no longer hung her happiness, her sense of worth, on the hope of their recognition or validation. She had planted new roots, deep and strong, in the fertile ground of her own life, as the sun dipped lower over the ocean, casting long, golden streaks across the gentle waves, painting the sky in flaming oranges and deep purples. Helen rose from her chair on the porch and walked slowly down the small path leading to the beach. The sand was cool beneath her bare feet, the air crisp and clean with the scent of salt and distant rain. She found her favorite spot, a flat, smooth rock nestled just far enough from the encroaching waves to stay dry, and sat down, pulling her soft quilt tighter around her shoulders. Above her, a lone gull cried out, its voice sharp and clear, soaring effortlessly into the dying light of the day. Helen closed her eyes and listened to the constant murmur of the sea, to the whisper of the sky, to the steady, quiet pulse of her own heart beating in her chest. There were no regrets here, no lingering bitterness, no ache for things lost or left behind, only a profound sense of peace and gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, even the painful ones. Gratitude for the pain itself, for it had been the catalyst that forced her to grow, to change, to finally choose herself. Gratitude for the quiet courage it had taken to walk away, to build something new without apology or explanation. She thought of Benjamin, his steady presence, his quiet faith in her strength, and she smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. She could almost hear his voice in the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. Find something that grows with you. Helen had found it in the easy laughter of new friends, in the riotous colors of her paintings, in the soft, resilient shoots of her garden. And most importantly, she had found it within herself. The tide crept closer, the playful waves reaching out as if to touch her toes, then pulling back, shy and hesitant. Helen opened her eyes and whispered a small prayer into the twilight. Not a prayer of longing or pleading, but one of simple, profound thanks for the woman she had been, for the woman she had become, for the life she had built, not out of fear or duty, but out of deliberate choice and unwavering hope. She stayed there until the first stars blinked awake overhead, their pale, distant light scattered across the velvet expanse of the night sky, like scattered promises. Then, with a soft sigh of contentment, she rose and walked slowly back towards her small cottage, the sand cold and familiar beneath her feet. Helen didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her story, her future, was no longer behind her, tied to the past she had left. It was ahead, unwritten, unhurried, entirely hers alone to shape. And for the first time in a very long time, Helen was exactly where she was meant to be,